Do you believe in forgiving or forgetting?
Imagine this. It's 1 in the morning and the pounding rain outside my window hasn't let up since dinner, but nothing prepares you for the thud against your front door that sounds like the world cracking open. Your grown daughter, Emily, slumping there on the porch, face swollen and streaked with tears and mud, gasping out words that hit harder than any fist ever could, about her husband Mark laying into her because of some side piece he's been sneaking around with, and in that split second, all the years I spent locking up creeps like him come rushing back as I grab my old badge from the drawer, dial a number etched in my brain from decades ago, and whisper into the phone that the plan we've whispered about in bars after bad busts is finally kicking off. Because no lowlife gets to touch my girl and walk away clean. The downpour had been relentless that entire evening, turning the quiet streets of my suburban neighborhood into slick rivers that reflected the occasional flash of headlights from cars hurrying home, but inside my modest ranch-style house on Elmwood Drive, I'd been content with a cup of chamomile tea and the low hum of a late-night news rerun. The kind that drones on about politics and weather without demanding much from a retired cop like me who preferred the silence of 5 years off the force. When that frantic knocking, or was it more of a desperate scraping, echoed through the hallway, it pulled me from the couch with a jolt that made my bad knee ache from old injuries sustained during chases through Chicago's back alleys, and as I flipped on the porch light, the sight of Emily there, her usually impeccable bob haircut plastered to her forehead and her designer coat torn at the sleeve, sent a wave of maternal fury crashing over me stronger than any storm outside. She barely managed to whisper the details as I guided her inside, supporting her weight against my shoulder while she explained how Mark had exploded after she questioned the unfamiliar lipstick stain on his collar and the late-night texts lighting up his phone from someone named Lisa, a woman he'd met through work who apparently offered more excitement than the routine of their 8-year marriage, and in his rage, he'd shoved her against the kitchen counter hard enough to leave those vivid bruises snaking up her arm like accusations she couldn't hide. I settled her on the living room sofa with a blanket pulled from the ottoman, the fabric still carrying the faint scent of lavender from laundry days gone by, and fetched a cold compress from the freezer for the swelling around her eye, all the while listening as she poured out the fragments of their unraveling life together. How Mark's real estate business had boomed in the suburbs with houses selling like hotcakes to young families chasing the American dream, but lately the deals had soured, leaving him irritable and distant, snapping at her over dinner about bills piling up even as he vanished for hours. That stretched into the night. My mind, trained from 25 years on the force to spot the patterns in domestic chaos, immediately connected the dots to the excuses she'd made during our weekly phone calls. The way she'd laugh off his temper as stress from closing deals while I wondered from afar if the man I'd once approved of at their wedding was showing his true colors under pressure, and now here she was, 32 years old with a career in graphic design that kept her independent, reduced to hiding at her mother's door because love had twisted into something ugly and unforgiving. As she drifted into an uneasy sleep, her breathing ragged but steady under the dim lamplight, I retreated to the spare bedroom where boxes of my past life gathered dust in the closet. Pulling out the neatly folded police uniform that I'd kept as a reminder of triumphs and failures alike, the starched blue fabric crisp despite the years, and it fit over my frame just as snugly as it had during my last shift, evoking memories of stakeouts and courtroom testimonies that had put away far worse than a cheating husband with a mean streak. With steady hands, I reached for my old flip phone tucked in the box, scrolling to the contact for Ray Harlan, my former partner whose gravelly voice had backed me up through countless investigations before he retired to a quiet life fishing on Lake Michigan. And when he answered after 3 rings with a groggy demand to know what fresh hell this was, I laid it all out in hushed tones, describing Emily's injuries and Mark's betrayal without exaggeration, his immediate shift to alert professionalism confirming he'd drop everything to help as we sketched the beginnings of a plan over the line, discreet inquiries into Mark's finances and associates first, building a case that could stand without alerting him too soon. Hanging up felt like igniting a fuse I'd long kept dormant, the kind of resolve that turns a protective mother into an unstoppable force, and while Emily rested, I moved to the kitchen table with her borrowed laptop, sifting through the shared family cloud drive for any overlooked clues like vacation photos that might capture Mark's wandering eyes or receipts from dinners he claimed were business only. My dry sense of humor surfacing in a quiet chuckle at how predictable these philandering types always turned out to be, dressing up their selfishness in excuses about providing for the family when really they were just chasing thrills that left wreckage behind. By the time the clock neared 3, I'd composed an anonymous email to the tip line at Mark's real estate firm, hinting at irregularities in his client accounts tied to personal indulgences without naming names. A clever nudge designed to spark an internal audit that would keep him scrambling and off balance, the satisfaction of that small strike warming me more than the cooling tea as I hit send and watched the confirmation pop up. Dawn crept in with a gray light filtering through the curtains, rousing Emily with questions about staying longer and what I intended to do next, her vulnerability making my heart ache even as I assured her we'd handle this step by step. But just as we shared a quiet breakfast of toast and fruit, my phone vibrated with an incoming call from a blocked number, the voice on the other end low and menacing, warning me in no uncertain terms to back off from meddling in Mark's affairs or risk Emily facing consequences far worse than a bruised face, the threat hanging in the air like the last drops of rain on the windowpane, leaving me to stare at the device in stunned silence as the line went dead and the uncertainty of who else lurked in the shadows began to tighten its grip around us both. Emily stirred awake that gray morning with the kind of groggy confusion that comes from a night fractured by pain and half-remembered reassurances, her fingers tentatively probing the tender spots on her face as she sat up on the couch where I'd left her wrapped in the Afghan, the kitchen already filling with the aroma of fresh coffee brewing strong and black the way we both liked it after tough days. And as she shuffled in rubbing her eyes, I could see the internal tug-of-war playing out in her expression, a mix of gratitude for the safety here and the nagging pull back to the life she'd built with Mark despite the cracks now spiderwebbing through it like faults in a foundation nobody bothered to inspect until the quake hit. Over those scrambled eggs and slices of toast slathered with butter that I plated up to keep things feeling routine amid the chaos, she started defending him almost immediately, her voice soft but insistent as she described how Mark's temper had always simmered just below the surface during their college days, but only boiled over lately with the real estate market dipping and clients backing out on deals that promised to shore up their savings for the family they talked about starting, insisting that the shove last night was a one-off born from his frustration over discovering Lisa's messages himself and panicking under the spotlight of her questions, though I knew from the patterns I'd seen in countless case files that such incidents rarely stood alone, often escalating from slaps to something far more sinister if the underlying issues like infidelity and financial strain weren't addressed head-on. I listened without interrupting at first, stirring my own cup while memories of my own marriage to Tom flickered unbidden. How I'd excused his late nights at the precinct bar as overtime stress until the divorce papers forced me to admit the drinking and wandering had eroded our trust long before Emily was old enough to notice the tension at dinner tables, a regret that made me gentle in steering the conversation toward what she planned to do next, suggesting she stay put for a few more days to let the bruises heal and her head clear, all while inwardly steeling myself against the urge to drive straight to their house and confront Mark myself, knowing that knee-jerk reaction could scatter the evidence we needed to build something solid against him. By mid-morning, with the rain finally tapering off into a misty drizzle that left the lawns glistening under a reluctant sun, we moved to the dining table where I pulled out her laptop and phone, encouraging her to walk me through the digital trail of their unraveling without pushing too hard, and as she hesitantly unlocked the accounts, we uncovered a trove of deleted emails and cached photos that painted a vivid picture of Mark's double life, from flirty exchanges with Lisa about stolen afternoons at coffee shops downtown to selfies of them at a lakeside bar I'd recognize from stakeouts years ago, her arm draped possessively around his waist in a way that screamed more than casual office camaraderie, and I couldn't suppress a dry chuckle at the sheer predictability of it all. How this slick real estate broker with his polished pitches and family man facade had fallen into the oldest trap of chasing skirt on the side while his wife picked up the emotional slack at home. Ray checked in around noon with a voice message updating me on his discreet calls to a couple of Mark's former colleagues. Nothing explosive yet, but enough whispers of him bending rules on property appraisals to keep clients happy and commissions flowing. The kind of corner-cutting that resonated with the economic squeezes so many middle-class families faced in these suburbs where house prices soared but jobs stayed shaky, tying directly into Emily's offhand mentions of their budget tightening. Despite his boasts of big sales, and it sparked the idea for our next move, a low-stakes way to turn up the heat without alerting him to our involvement, suggesting we attend the annual block party that evening where the neighborhood association hosted barbecues and games to foster that sense of community everyone pretended was unbreakable. Emily wavered at first, her loyalty flaring up in a rush of memories about the man who'd swept her off her feet with weekend getaways and promises of forever, but the fresh hurt won out as she agreed. And by late afternoon we were prepping with her applying concealer to mask the fading marks and me digging out a sundress from my closet that hid the slight paunch from retirement indulgences. Arriving at the park just as grills fired up and kids chased frisbees across the grass under strings of bulb lights that twinkled like false stars. Mingling among the folding tables laden with potato salad and deviled eggs, we zeroed in on a cluster of women from Mark's realty office, their laughter loosening after a few plastic cups of wine as I casually brought up office gossip under the guise of small talk about the housing market, dropping hints about a certain senior agent's rumored distractions that had them exchanging knowing glances and pulling out phones to share screenshots of group chats buzzing with speculation. The witty orchestration unfolding seamlessly when one of them forwarded a photo of Mark and Lisa from a recent team outing that I'd subtly described earlier, ensuring the rumor mill churned hot enough to reach him by nights, and without a trace leading back to us. As the evening wound down with families packing up lawn chairs and the air cooling into a crisp autumn bite, we slipped away feeling the small thrill of that payback, Emily even cracking a reluctant smile at how his charm offensive might falter under the weight of his colleagues' side eyes, but the victory soured the moment we reached my driveway, where a folded note was wedged under the car's windshield wiper, the handwriting unmistakably Mark's in its hurried scrawl, demanding Emily return home immediately or face consequences that twisted my gut with the direct threat now aimed squarely at pulling me deeper into the fray he clearly intended to escalate. That crumpled note from Mark lingered on the kitchen counter like a venomous spider waiting to strike, its bold letters spelling out demands for Emily's immediate return laced with veiled threats about consequences that could unravel the fragile peace we'd carved out in my home, forcing us both to confront the escalating danger as the morning light filtered through the blinds and cast long shadows across the tile floor where we'd paced for hours debating whether to ignore it or use it as leverage in our quiet campaign against him. Emily's defenses surged back with a fierceness that caught me off guard, her voice rising in a torrent of justifications as she clutched the paper, insisting that Mark's words stemmed from desperation rather than malice, painting him as a man cornered by mounting pressures from the housing slump that had half his listings sitting empty while creditors circled like vultures over their joint accounts, and though I recognized the familiar denial in her eyes, the same one I'd worn like a badge during my own marital blind spots years ago, I held my tongue, opting instead to brew another pot of coffee and suggest we loop in Ray for a proper assessment before making any rash moves that might tip our hand too early. By midday, with the neighborhood settling into its Saturday rhythm of lawnmowers and distant laughter from backyard gatherings, we piled into my old sedan and headed to Ray's cluttered garage on the outskirts of town. The air inside thick with the metallic tang of tools and the faint mustiness of archived case files stacked in cardboard boxes that spoke to his inability to fully let go of the job even in retirement, where he greeted us with a nod and a thermos of his notoriously bitter brew. Diving straight into the prelims he'd gathered overnight from back channels at the department that painted Mark not just as a philanderer, but as someone skirting the edges of outright fraud in his real estate dealings. As Emily hovered uncertainly by the workbench, Flipping through printouts of transaction logs that showed inflated appraisals on properties sold to unsuspecting buyers, Ray introduced me to Carla, an old informant from my patrol days who now slung drinks at a dive bar near the commercial district, her sharp eyes and no-nonsense demeanor unchanged since the times she'd tipped us off on bar fights turning into assaults and over lukewarm mugs. She laid out the connections she'd overheard during Mark's increasingly frequent happy hours with Lisa, describing how the woman wasn't merely a mistress, but a catalyst pushing him to doctor paperwork for her family's struggling construction firm, funneling kickbacks through shell accounts that disguised the scheme as legitimate consulting fees while leaving Emily in the dark about the risks to their shared assets. The dilemma deepened when Emily interjected with a shaky defense, admitting she'd glimpsed odd deposits in their bank statements but chalked them up to Mark's savvy networking in a cutthroat market, her loyalty clashing against the mounting evidence like waves battering a crumbling pier, and I felt a pang of reluctant empathy for her position. Knowing full well how love could blind you to the red flags waving in your face until they slapped you hard enough to leave marks, much like the ones fading on her skin that served as stark reminders of the human cost behind those financial games. Carla's insights carried a wry edge, her chuckle low as she recounted Mark boasting to Lisa about outsmarting the system the way every overconfident schmuck thought he could without getting caught, the kind of hubris I'd seen derail careers in boardrooms and precincts alike. And it fueled our decision to strike back with something precise and humiliating, guiding Emily through a secure proxy on Ray's ancient desktop to access Mark's work email via a forgotten shared password she'd mentioned. From their early days, sifting through the incriminating threads that detailed rendezvous points and coded discussions of the fraudulent flips until we isolated a chain ripe for exposure. With careful editing to anonymize our involvement, we forwarded select excerpts to his office group list disguised as a glitchy auto-reply from his own account, the humorous twist landing when the messages popped up during what we timed to coincide with their weekly team meeting. Imagining the room erupting in awkward coughs and sidelong glances as colleagues pieced together the broker's not-so-secret side hustle and steamy distractions, a payback that satisfied the itch for justice without crossing into outright illegality, yet leaving him scrambling to contain the fallout from his own digital footprints. As the afternoon waned into a golden haze over the garage windows, the small wind buoyed us enough to head back with Emily quieter but resolute, but the mood shattered when Ray's printer spat out a grainy scan from an old public record he'd cross-referenced, revealing a long-buried link between Mark's late father and a bribery scandal I'd investigated 20 years prior during my first big corruption bust in the suburbs. The implications twisting like a knife as it dawned on me that this affair might entangle not just Emily's future, but echoes of my own unresolved cases from a lifetime ago, pulling the shadows of the past right into our present fight. The grainy scan from Ray's printer haunted me through the drive back home that fading afternoon, its faded ink outlining connections between Mark's family legacy and the corruption case I'd cracked wide open 2 decades earlier in a dingy precinct interrogation room where bribes flowed as freely as the coffee, forcing me to grapple with the uncomfortable possibility that Emily's marriage had unwittingly looped back into the very shadows I'd spent my career chasing, all while she sat shotgun, staring out at the passing strip malls with a silence that screamed her growing doubts about the man she'd vowed to stand by through better or worse. Tension simmered to a boil over dinner that evening, the takeout Chinese spread across the table going cold as Emily pushed back against my suggestions for deeper involvement, her fork clattering against the plate as she argued that confronting Mark directly would only inflame his paranoia and risk the stability of their home, the one with the white picket fence and herb garden she'd tended through lean years, insisting instead on handling it privately like adults who could salvage the good amid the wreckage rather than dragging in outsiders who might turn it all into a spectacle. And I felt a surge of frustration mixed with reluctant understanding, knowing her stance echoed the choices I'd made in my own fractured union, covering for Tom's indiscretions to keep the family intact until the lies piled too high to ignore. The clash peaked when she announced her intent to meet him alone the next day at a neutral coffee shop to hash things out. her eyes pleading for space even as I countered with warnings drawn from files full of women who'd tried the same olive branch only to end up isolated and more vulnerable. The emotional rift widening as she accused me of projecting my bitterness from the divorce onto her situation, a barb that stung because part of me wondered if she was right, if my protective instincts had warped into something overbearing that pushed her further into denial rather than pulling her towards safety. By morning, with the sun breaking through scattered clouds to mock our unease, we'd compromised on a plan where I'd tail her discreetly from a distance. Parking across the street from Mark's sleek real estate office in the bustling commercial strip, where glass facades reflected the hurry of professionals chasing commissions, and as Emily slipped inside under the pretense of picking up forgotten paperwork, I circled the block to scout the back entrance, spotting Lisa's red coupe idling in the lot with her at the wheel scrolling her phone, a subtle clue in the form of a matching key fob dangling from the mirror that hinted at shared access to more than just his schedule. Seizing the moment for a clever sting, I approached under the guise of a lost client seeking directions, engaging her in chit-chat about the local market until I could slip a tiny tracker disguised as a promotional keychain onto her bag during a feigned fumble with my map, the witty payback unfolding as the device pinged her location straight to Ray's app, allowing us to map her routine rendezvous with Mark and potentially expose the affair's financial underbelly to his superiors without direct confrontation. But the scheme backfired almost immediately when she glanced up sharply, her eyes narrowing in suspicion before she peeled out with tires screeching, forcing me to duck into a nearby alley as Mark emerged from the building, barking orders into his phone about damage control from the email leak. Emily texted moments later that the meeting had gone south fast, Mark's charm evaporating into accusations about her stirring up trouble with his work circle, and, before I could circle back to extract her, chaos erupted with him grabbing her arm in the lobby visible through the plate glass, dragging her toward his car parked out front while security hesitated amid the lunchtime foot traffic, the brief abduction unfolding in heart-pounding seconds as she struggled and called my name, alliances shifting unexpectedly when a passerby intervened with shouts that bought just enough time for me to sprint across the street, but not before Mark bundled her into the passenger seat and sped off toward the highway, leaving me breathless and dialing Ray in a panic as the reality of his desperation forced my hand into a pursuit that blurred the line between careful planning and outright recklessness. The screech of Mark's tires echoed in my ears long after he'd vanished into the midday traffic snarl on the highway feeder road, leaving me doubled over by the curb with my phone pressed to my ear as Ray's voice cut through the panic with clipped instructions to track the car's plates through traffic cams while I raced to my sedan and gunned the engine in pursuit, the familiar adrenaline from high-stakes chases flooding back despite the years off the badge and making my hands steady on the wheel as I weaved through commuter lanes under a sky threatening another round of that relentless rain. Emily's last text had been a frantic plea about heading to the old family cabin by the lake, the one where we'd spent summers fishing and roasting marshmallows during her childhood before the divorce turned it into a dusty relic of better days. And as Ray patched in updates confirming the route, I pieced together Mark's likely play, using the isolation up there to coerce her into silence about the affair and fraud before vanishing with whatever cash he could scrape from their accounts, a desperate gambit that exposed his vulnerabilities more than he realized. Tying straight into the old bribery network his father had fronted years ago, which I'd exposed, but never fully dismantled due to higher-ups pulling strings for political favors. By the time I crested the winding access road an hour later, the cabin's weathered siding loomed through the pines like a forgotten sentinel, fog rolling off the water in thick veils that muffled the crunch of gravel under my tires. And I killed the headlights to approach on foot, heart thumping with the weight of what might unfold inside those creaky walls where arguments could echo unchecked, slipping my service revolver from the glove box, a relic I'd kept loaded for just such contingencies, while texting Ray our exact position for backup that I hoped wouldn't arrive too late to tip the scales. Voices carried faintly from the porch as I circled to the rear, Mark's tone a volatile mix of wheedling apologies and sharp demands for Emily to delete any evidence she'd gathered. Her response is laced with the exhaustion of someone finally seeing through the facade of the provider who'd promised security only to gamble it away on lies, and a woman who dangled escape like a carrot. And the scene shifted dramatically when Lisa's coupe pulled up out front with a spray of mud, her emergence in high heels ill-suited for the terrain adding a layer of absurdity that almost drew a bitter laugh from me as she stormed in clutching a briefcase that screamed last-minute accounting. Bursting through the side door caught them all off balance, Mark whirling from the kitchen table where family photos gathered dust amid scattered papers outlining the fraudulent flips. His face paling at the sight of me in partial uniform with the gun leveled low but firm, while Emily surged to her feet with relief warring against betrayal in her eyes, and Lisa froze mid-accusation, spilling that she'd been using Mark as much as he'd used her, seducing him into the schemes to bail out her own family's crumbling empire tied to the same corrupt developer I'd busted long ago. A twist that revealed her not as the innocent other woman, but a calculating player who'd manipulated the affair for leverage, promising him a cut if he fudged the docs, but planning all along to flip the evidence against him for immunity. The witty justice unfolded in that charged standoff as I laid out the chain of proofs we'd amassed, from the leaked emails to the tracker pings and Ray's cross-reference files, watching Mark's bluster crumble into stammered pleas for a deal. His salesman charm reduced to pathetic haggling over the remnants of his double life, and with Emily nodding through tears at the full scope of his deceptions, including siphon savings meant for their future kids, I chose mercy over the full vengeance of a takedown shot, instead dialing Ray to roll up with the unmarked cruiser that cuffed Mark on the spot for the fraud charges that would stick harder than any domestic rap, Lisa spilling more beans in a bid for leniency as they hauled her away too. The satisfaction of seeing him frog marched out under the emerging stars, a small balm for the nights I'd lain awake worrying about my daughter's choices. Dawn painted the lake in soft pinks as Emily and I sat on the porch steps afterward, the cabin's silence now a tentative peace broken only by the lap of water against the dock. Her questions tumbling out about whether we'd truly won or just delayed the next fracture in a world where men like Mark thrived on unchecked greed and systems that protected the powerful more than the bruised, leaving me to hold her hand without easy answers, pondering if my plan had mended our bond or merely exposed how some shadows from the past linger indefinitely, especially when justice feels as ambiguous as the fog lifting over the horizon, uncertain about her path forward in a life forever altered by the truths we'd unearthed.